Whether it's an effort to increase girls' participation in a traditionally male-dominated sport like football, or a response to a funding cut that required a creative solution to keep fielding teams at all, practitioners and researchers recognize the promise of mixed-gender sports to get and keep kids active and healthy and create powerful spaces for kids to learn some of the most important social-emotional lessons. But how did a Milwaukee-based soccer team and a Washington, D.C. founded flag football team actually do it? Kate Carpenter joins us today. She's the executive director of the Milwaukee Scores, an affiliate of America Scores. She's also the director of the Milwaukee Kickers Soccer Club. And she's on Twitter at Kate_J Carpenter. If you want to tweet, we have several panelists with handles, and we're also at Aspen Inst Sports, #ProjectPlay. Next to her is Carl Ehrlich. He's the founder and CEO of Flagstar Football, which provides mixed-gender flag football in the DMV area. He's also a former captain of the Harvard football team. And Marge Snyder is the Senior Director of Research and Programs for the Women's Sports Foundation. She developed the award-winning Go Girl Go project, and she's at Marge Snyder. We're going to have a bit of a conversation up here, but we also want to have a chance to hear from all of you. So please log on to as.pn/ppsummit-slido as you have questions that come up throughout the session. Put your questions there. Look at what other questions other guests are asking. You can upvote them if you really like them. And at the end of the session, my colleague Marty will read out the questions that we'll have the chance to answer today. So I want to get us started, Kate and Carl. Why did you decide to have mixed gender programming in Scores and in Flagstar?
I'll start. Honestly, it was a backdoor response to a funding cut that happened in Milwaukee, which was going to require us to reduce staff and programming by 50%. So we said, well, where are we going to make the cut? Is it the service to kids or the staffing? And at the time, we said, okay, well, we're going to have to reduce our staff, which does mean we're going to have to reduce a little bit how we form our teams, because traditionally we'd been running a boys team and a girls team that required 2 coaches. And if we were going to have to take some sort of reduction, we would be going down to 1 coach. And we thought at that time, well, in order to make sure that we're not leaving too many kids behind in this process, we will combine teams to make sure that we can continue to provide service.
Amazing.
Great. Yeah, I mean, Flagstar football just started 4 or 5 years ago now, and so we just defaulted to full inclusion for everyone, and that was like, genders or people with different learning disabilities or backgrounds and things like that, and so we just defaulted to total inclusion and then kind of worked from there.
Yeah. Kate, you shared with me a little bit in one of our earlier conversations that you also used to actually combine schools so that you could field a team, and then you took the step to combine genders. Can you talk about what you saw sort of in this first step when you were facing some funding cuts, and then what prompted the switch and what you've seen in combining genders rather than schools?
Right. So it's probably no secret that it is a little bit harder sometimes to engage girls in sport. And we would often find that plenty of boys were signing up to be in Scores, but we also wanted to make sure that we were serving 50% of the girls. And in order to respond to that need, you have to get creative sometimes. And if we had a school that was couple of schools that were short on girls, they would practice at their school locations during the week, but on game day we would combine them as one team. It was fabulous in this skill building of how to be a team, how to make friends, how to move beyond the unknown of the person next to you to be able to come and be competitive on a Friday. So in there was some resiliency of how kids can respond and work together regardless of the situation. We had, honestly, when we were looking at this co-ed scenario or mixed gender scenario, we were initially thinking about responding to a need in our community about removing gender labels at all, and how are we going to be ready for that and be inclusive and make a safe environment. And so before this co-ed, we were actually thinking about what would be the creative way to do this. We can talk about that later, but as a result, we just rolled into this co-ed scenario based on the fact that the kids were already in this environment on their school day and they were coming from school day to us. So we didn't figure it was going to be a jarring change for them. And it largely wasn't.
Yeah. And Marge, when we spoke, you were sharing with me that there may be some unique barriers to sport in mixed gender settings and barriers that really uniquely affect certain populations that might not affect others. What are some of those barriers and which groups might be disproportionately affected by mixed gender settings?
Well, I think that they, for girls in particular, I come from the Women's Sports Foundation, so I'm looking through a gender lens every day, all day long. Certainly they face disproportionate barriers at the individual level. Girls are thinking and feeling about themselves differently than boys do. So there's still an appearance culture for girls, and they still care about what they look like, and others care about what they look like. For boys, that just really doesn't exist. So at the community level, you have other kinds of barriers, right, where many of you are probably familiar with it. They could be transportation barriers, they could be cultural barriers. Some immigrant populations don't actually want their girls participating in sport. And then at the overall cultural level, we still, let me back up one step and say generally speaking, girls don't see other women playing sport. They don't see them coaching sport. They don't see them at the professional level. They don't see them administering the programs very much. So they look out there and they don't see anybody like themselves. And you could just sort of multiply that many times over for other populations, girls with disabilities, boys with disabilities, girls and boys who may be born as girls and boys but don't identify as a girl or a boy, so they don't see those role models either. So there's a whole host of things that have to be taken into consideration when you decide that you want to make sport mixed gender. And I mean, the founder of the Women's Sports Foundation long ago said, the world is co-ed. So
Can you remind us who that is?
Billie Jean King. So, it's something that we should be aiming for, and I think there are lots of exciting ways to get there, and Kate and Carl are talking about some of those.
Yeah. Carl, I mean, football's an interesting sport, right? Because it's often perceived as a boy sport. In a lot of ways, there are many sports that both girls and boys play, and football is a sport that's been dominated by boys and by men. How is flag perceived, and how has flag, as a relatively new sport, given you the opportunity to maybe push some of those perceptions?
Yeah, so I think that's the big advantage that we had being kind of a new player, and that football's been ingrained and has community programs, but flag football and youth flag football is relatively new, so we got a chance to start with a clean slate, establish new norms, and kind of establish that in this in this space we act like this, or in this space we do this, and in this space from the jump we said everyone's included, everyone's involved, and I think that we're starting to see more and more participation amongst girls. The NFL, there's maybe it's like 50% of all NFL viewership is women. There's a huge demand for it, and I think. Like Marge said, the world is co-ed, and so when we started it new, we got a chance to kind of create a little model like that.
Yeah. I mean, so talk to me about those norms, those traditions, and how are you actually doing this? Because my guess is there are a lot of people in the audience who are here today because they think, yeah, that sounds great, but then also, well, I don't even know where to start. How do I do that? So what have, Kate, you and Carl, what have you learned about? How do you actually do this?
It's easier than you think philosophically. InScores, I think Carl just spoke to it. This is how we do this here. So when we went from the traditional single sex model to mixed gender, it was this is scores, and we're going to play as a team, and we didn't draw a whole lot of attention to this is going to be different. For kids, it was an easy role. Again, they already play. We serve elementary school children, so they're already doing PE together. They're already in recess together. So for them, it wasn't unusual. It was going to be more the education for coaches and for families and addressing cultural issues and a lot of the other boundaries that come from basically the grown-ups in the space and the kids. So in the presentation, if it's just this is who we are, this is how we compete, we're all part of this team, And without a lot of mixed messaging in the process, it does allow itself to have some success, but the back end of this is how you manage adults and coaches, which probably a whole other panel.
It's all managing adults and coaches. I think sometimes the only real challenge that we face is sometimes we'll see people that are deterred from the league because it's a co-ed league, because it's maybe not the intent or perceived as the intense football experience that they're wanting for. That is a helpful screening device for us and parents, because if they have opposition to that, then they probably don't fit the values. I think it's all, I would say, just like Kate said, it's probably maybe easier in implementation than you'd think. I think there's a kind of a selectivity bias that we see, where the girls that are playing are like maybe disproportionately just beasts. They're unbelievable athletes, and so it's like not almost a true sample size. But I think it's super productive because they come in and not only they're part of the team and active parts of the team and teammates, but also just great players, and I think that's important for everybody to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of, it almost doesn't matter, just treat everyone the same is an interesting one. And I want to go ahead and play a clip in just a second. The second clip from Kristine Lilly, who I recently hosted on a podcast about mixed gender sport. I hosted Kristine Lilly, who is the most capped soccer player in the history of sport, of any nationality and of any gender, with 354 international appearances. And here's what she had to say about growing up playing in co-ed settings.
The impact it has on the opposite sex, not either sex, the boys seeing the girls, or the girls seeing the boys, it adds some respect there. And I think the boys, whether they're taught like, oh, girls can't play, and then they see a girl play, they're like, well, girls can play. Someone's telling me this, and now I see it. So I think it just adds that little a piece to, because subconsciously to all these kids' heads, like, okay, well, there's girls around, that's great. There's boys around, that's great. So let's play.
So let's play, right? I mean, how simple is that? I mean, Marge, what considerations need to be part of the conversation? Because it sounds easy, right? Like, okay, let's play. Yeah. What have you seen in research and maybe in coaching and how to do this?
Yeah. Well, I think coaching is key, and training is key, and having an understanding that equality is great, and we could say, let's just make everything equal, but the truth is that kids don't start in the same place, whether they're girls or boys or non-binary or LGBTQ of some portion. They're not starting from the same place. They're not starting from the same place when they're from a community where maybe they're from lower socioeconomic status. They're not starting from the same place when they're oftentimes kids of color. So they're just not starting from the same place. So understanding that every kid is different, right, I think is an important consideration. And that if we're going to take, for example, for girls and boys, there are developmental differences between girls and boys. As I mentioned earlier, girls, there's still this appearance culture. It turns out that research says that for girls, they have a much wider array of things and activities that they are interested in and that they can do. So they're interested in not only sports, but they're interested, they get their self-esteem and confidence from other things, like participating in music and band or dance if it's not competitive. So they have a much they're interested in more sports than boys are. Boys tend to get narrower about what their sports interests are, and sport is one of the few places that young boys get their confidence from. So it's incredibly important to them that they have a positive experience there, and that they're good at it. For girls, if they find out they're not good at something, or they're not having a good experience, they'd say, well, I'm just going to stop. Boys, they kind of keep playing right through it for quite a bit longer. So there are those kinds of things to think about. And so, for example, for creating, as you were saying, Carla, an inclusive environment means also including kids. So including them in the decision-making processes, listening to them, making changes and being flexible about what's happening. So checking in with kids when they come to sport. Somehow we think that kids come to sport and they're just going to jump onto the field and they're going to do exactly what we tell them to do. And it's not like that at all. They've had a bad day, they got a bad score on their test, something's going on at home, so there are all kinds of things that have to be taken into consideration when you are, dealing with this. Yeah. They're not amorphous. Yeah.
And Kate, it's interesting because you wear two hats, right? So you're the executive director of Milwaukee Scores, and you're also the director of the Milwaukee Kickers Soccer Club, which you described to me kind of in your own words as like a suburban travel club. Can you talk about if that club is co-ed and why or why not, and what are some of the questions you're grappling with as we're talking about different kinds of settings and different ways that we organize sport for kids from all different parts of our communities?
Yes, you did give me a nice promotion. I am actually I'm the director of one of many of the regions that the club organizes, but I'll let my boss know when I get back. So it is really interesting, and so while I said, you know, we just said at Scores, this is how it is, this is how it's going to roll. I actually do not want to undersell the intentionality that you actually really have to bring to this scenario. So it may, you know, I didn't mean to be flippant in that scenario, because, as you said, I'm sitting in two different spaces. So one was a response to an immediate crisis. We actually had been talking about how to be more inclusive and move away in Scores from this single sex notion, based on a movement within our school district, and their PE was no longer like girls are on the side of the gym, boys are on the other. They were actually starting to have these conversations about letting kids opt in on high intensity and low intensity, and then you didn't actually have to divide yourself by how you were identifying, but just about where you were comfortable in the space. So before the funding cut, we were actually thinking about how would that look on our Scores game day, and so that we could make sure that it was inclusive and kids were wanting to be here regardless of how they were identifying. The funding cut made us, you know, react a little bit quicker. The interesting in what I told you was the pushback here, as in my travel club, I was wondering why I wasn't able to have the same conversation and be as sort of relaxed and inclusive in the thinking. And it is not right now co-ed after 6 years old, and honestly I had been very, very adamant about not making it that way. So there are some things that I still am trying to figure out how would that look in our club. There was a question on Twitter yesterday about, you know, if you were traditionally a club that has been single sex, how would you change this? Would you do it right away? Would you do it? And I was thinking to myself, like, you're right, like, how would I start that in our club of 6,000? It's not going to be an easy conversation, but for us, I think it would be a slow roll, starting with the younger ages and, you know, moving up. But again, if you don't have every adult and, you know, on the same page with you, you're going to be really rowing up, you know, a pretty fast moving stream for sure.
Yeah, and Marge and Carl, I'm wondering, right? So we often think about mixed gender as girls playing with boys, or maybe a girl playing on the boys' team, right? And kind of what we're talking about here is actually how do we have mixed gender teams that are more than just the one girl who's playing on boys' teams. But it still has always felt like this, like, girls play with boys and not like a boys play with girls kind of directional arrow. And I'm curious, how can mixed gender teams actually give boys more sports opportunities? And whichever one of you feels you want to answer.
I'll take a stab at it. I think, you know, as I said earlier, that for boys, they tend to funnel into certain sports, right? So if all the boys are funneling into the football, basketball, baseball, soccer channel, you know, there's going to be a lot of competition. There's going to be really less opportunity, particularly for the less skilled athlete, less skilled boy. So I think that there are a lot of other sports that girls are participating as well, where boys could be have a space and might be good at. And these are sort of sports that are traditionally thought of as girls' sports. So they'd be something like gymnastics, where if you go to the local YMCA, you know, and you see the gymnastics activity going on, it's almost exclusively girls, right? And maybe there's one boy. So it's sort of the reverse of a lot of sports. And the same could be said of a sport, say, like field hockey or even volleyball, where it's not the most popular sport in the U.S. for boys, but it's highly popular for girls. So I think that there are opportunities then for boys to experience this wider array of possibility that through mixed gender sports that they don't currently have.
Carl, any reflections on what mixed gender sports means for boys?
Well, I mean, I think it's radically important for young boys and young males to be on teams with girls. I just think it's super important. If they need to share workspaces and classrooms, and they need to share responsibility and leadership opportunities, it's just so radically important for boys to be playing with girls alongside. I think the question of how you integrate from the other direction with sports and gender is a super interesting question, and field hockey is probably the big model for it, right? Where it's like there's no real men's field hockey infrastructure in America, but it's like the third most popular sport in the world, right? And so the answer is probably along the same lines of inclusion, support, encouragement, because I was on Facebook the other day and there was a high school kid getting a lot of flack for playing with the girls and playing field hockey with the girls, but I think that's an interesting kind of question moving forward is how would you use that predominantly female platform as a launching pad to get more men and boys included in the sport?
I want to play another clip from our podcast. So joining me and Kristine Lilly was a friend of mine, Joe Malloy, who is a world champion triathlete in the mixed gender relay. And he was also the top American male at the Rio Olympic Games 2 years ago. And he had kind of this interesting thought about equality, but about something that's even more important than equality in mixed gender settings and what it's meant to him as a world champion male triathlete.
A lot of times the conversation goes to equal opportunities, equality between the athletes. And there's something above that, which is respect. And that's the piece that understands, you know what, I have this skill set and you have this skill set, and together we can be better. And to me, that's what mixed gender sports say. It doesn't say that, oh, we all deserve the same of everything. It's that, no, because you're here, I'm better, and because I'm here, you're better. And working to cultivate that kind of environment is to me the goal.
I think the question is, how do you cultivate that kind of an environment? Thoughts from what you've seen work in InScores, and if you're not organizing sport around gender, you spoke a little bit about how you are organizing it, but say more about that.
So first of all, everybody's got to listen to the podcast. It was great, and this whole question around equality really inspired me and had me thinking. But how do we do it in scores is exactly what he was saying. Is I think our coaches, we are really trying to get them to get kids to highlight with each other through share and learning that what is your strength, and can I play to your strength, and can you play to mine, and together we'll be more successful, which is how a team works regardless, right? Whether it's same sex or mixed gender, a successful team works on everybody's strengths and lifts people up, right? And so just that continued conversation about what it means to be a teammate, how do we respect each other, should be a genderless type of conversation, and more just about what it is that we do, what are our core values here. So and again, that comes back to the coaching of adults to create that kind of environment and have that kind of conversation. But I think it is sort of the most simple way to address a lot of these questions is if we can just continue to build on each other's strengths, we will succeed as a team.
It seems like from that podcast that the reality of it, I mean, even if mixed gender didn't make things better, there's still an argument for why you would do it, right? But I think like what the podcast says, and I was talking with a lot of coaches this weekend in preparation for this panel and asking about, what does mixed gender sports mean to you? And the answer I kept getting was, it makes everything better. It makes everything better, Even just having, this is a male dominant sport still, right? But even just having one or two girls in the huddle or on the team, I think they bring a certain diversity to that. And in my experience, that like emotional intelligence, empathy, and that kind of things that brings your team together, and that kind of emotional connection, I think is really genuinely enhanced by having it be a mixed gender environment.
Yeah.
And I think it also has the potential to eliminate to some degree this idea that girls aren't interested in sports, that they don't really care about anything, that they don't care to get better, they're not interested in competition. And it turns out that those things are all wrong. They are. And I was just going to add one other thing about this sort of idea of the mixed gender sports And how do we do this is we know from the Project Play work and from lots of other research that sports specialization is on the rise, and it's really not good. It's much better when kids play multiple sports. So how about if at the grassroots level, in the local communities, we move more towards a model where kids are introduced to multiple sports, through the same organization. And so that they don't just get soccer or basketball or flag football, but they get other field hockey. They get other sports.
Yeah. And so Project Play is really focused on 12 and under, right? And what we're talking about, we haven't actually put age limits on it, but we as a panel kind of know that we're thinking about 12 and under. Carl, your program's interesting because you actually have mixed gender sports through high school. So what does it mean as kids age? And can this conversation transcend really that 12-year-old kind of like pre-puberty divider that I think probably a lot of us have in our mind is this is all well and good for 12 and under, but it definitely doesn't work above that.
Yeah. Well, and then you also delineate travel and kind of like competitive maximization and recreational leagues, And so we are a recreational league, and so the girls that we had starting, they were playing in 2nd, 3rd grade, 4th, 5th grade, are now playing as they're getting older and getting older. The biggest advantage of that is really that it reinforces this idea that girls are playing, So when the younger girls come out and the game before them is 11th grade girls, these girls are really good at flag football. It's not like these girls are really good at flag football. And when they go out and just see them competing, playing hard, picking people up, being good teammates, pushing people around, I just think like the role model component to that is so important.
One of the favorite stories, we don't have a clip for this from the podcast, but I will plug that one of the favorite stories that Joe shared with me and that he shared with all of our listeners on the podcast actually was that the morning of the World Championships, he was thinking like, yeah, we want to go hard and that's fine and good. And he got a text message from his teammate, Gwen Jorgensen, who's the most dominant female triathlete of the past several years. And she said, Joe, I need this. And Joe says, well, that's when I knew we were going for broke, right? Like she was the one who said, this is win or bust. And we're not settling for anything less, in a way that even he was like, I don't want to get injured. We're 4 weeks before Rio. If we finish on the podium, that's cool. Yeah. So I think the way that the competitiveness, I think, can come out and creating these different settings where that's okay for kids of all genders to be fighting for sport with that kind of fire is really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a super productive environment. I don't have any data to back this up, but I played at Harvard's Division I athletic program, a ton of unbelievable women's teams, and I bet if you did a data dig on it, a lot of those college athletes were playing, softball players playing baseball, or Lily playing soccer or anything like that. There's a lot of integration like that.
Yeah. Are there any cons to mixed gender sport for girls, for boys, for kids of any gender, all genders?
Well, of course, there are some physical limitations. Speed, strength, all of those things come into play post puberty. But I think it should be an option that people are thinking about, and I think that many sports and games can be adapted in ways that make for fair competition and fair teamwork opportunities and a fair experience. And I use that word really deliberately because I think we do get focused a bit on equality, and really what we should be focused on is fairness and the experience that kids are having. And so sometimes that means that some kids need more assistance than other kids, and that's okay. But I do think that it's the physical aspects post-puberty can be somewhat limiting, challenging, but I think there are ways to overcome many of those in many sports.
Yeah. Any other cons you've seen in your experiences?
I don't see there being a con. I think for this to happen, like kind of what Marge is saying, it needs to be a carefully and thoughtfully constructed ecosystem, and that if it's not carefully constructed and if it's not built around inclusion and fairness, that it can go off the rails in ways that are counterproductive and maybe reinforce unproductive gender stereotypes. So I think the biggest risk is that it's just Lord of the Flies, and that it has to be a carefully constructed experience.
Yeah. Kate, anything you've seen that you think maybe says this isn't actually the best for every girl or for every boy?
No, I haven't bumped up against that necessarily. I do think there are some cultural challenges when you start to mix gender sport. Again, that's an education piece, but it is one to be sensitive of and aware of so that you're not creating, more challenges within a community that you're trying to bridge gaps. And as a result, I don't want kids not to participate. If there's a cultural challenge that's being addressed, then, we'll have to look at that differently. But other than that, no, I mean, as a soccer player who played at a high level, has coached college soccer, I mean, when I was done with sort of that part of my life, I played in a mixed gender league. I mean, that was where you went. So it's not, usually for a lot of adults, that is, for the recreational adult, that becomes the option. Mm-hmm. So learning how to work in that space at a younger age, is only just going to make your experience more positive long term. And if the goal, like for my goal is I want my kids to feel largely confident in whatever they're doing, competent, great if they move on, but I want them to be able to do a physical activity lifelong, right? And so if it's working with others, then learning how to do that sooner, really outweighs some of the other things that you can address with some intention, right? So no, to me that would be it, but those are things that can be managed and can be worked on, within your communities.
Yeah. I think the idea of introducing kids to at a young age so that they have opportunities later in life is so important. So the last clip we're going to play from the podcast is actually from Elana Meyers Taylor, who in 2014 became the first American woman in recent history, in about a 75-year period, to actually pilot a quote-unquote 4-man bobsled. Can we go ahead and play that clip? Clip 1.
Growing up, you don't really know the difference. You're just out there playing. So most of my experience was out there playing in the yard, stickball or kickball or what have you, and you don't really know the difference. Whether it's a man or a girl or a boy, it doesn't really matter. You just want to go out there and enjoy the game. And I think having those kind of experience shapes your relationships with gender later in life. So obviously in a formal setting, my bobsled career, it wasn't until I was, 7 years into the sport where I finally got the opportunity to compete in mixed gender. But because I had those experiences later on or early on in my career at the youth level with boys and everything like that, it wasn't something that really intimidated me. It wasn't something that I was looking at, I'm going to be the first woman to compete with these men or whatnot in 75 years, and I'm intimidated by it. It was like, no, I could play with boys when I was younger. It wasn't anything that I was ever intimidated by, and something I always had support under, and something that was always encouraged, just go out there and play. So I kind of approached it with that same sense.
And I think that's a great segue into this idea of, what is the future of mixed gender sport? First of all, does this matter, right? So is it about sport? Is it about things more than sport? And then, what are the implications of that for the world that we live in? The world is co-ed, right, as Billie Jean King said.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, in sport, we see it already. The Olympic Games are, as they are trying to make them more equitable, they are moving and adding sports that are mixed gender, right? So that because they want to, they see that this is part of the future. So I think that we can look at that and say, well, we better be there at the grassroots level then too, because we're moving towards that in sport. And it's just really a great opportunity for us to not be polarized as men and women if we have greater experiences as kids who are working together with members of the other sex or with kids who don't identify with any sex.
Right. So say more about that. I mean, how does mixed gender sport open up opportunities for kids who might not identify on this gender binary of girl, boy, man, woman when they get older?
Yeah, well, I was talking with Kate a little bit, and I actually said, do you actually ask whether or not a kid is a boy or a girl in your program? She says, no, we don't even bother asking, and we don't need to, right? So it doesn't even become part of the issue where kids are having to make a decision about that. They don't have to think about it. It's not something that is important to the experience. So I think it really makes for a much more level playing field when kids get involved in sport in that way, when they know that they do not have to be thinking about it. It's not a stressor for them. Yeah, and also obviously the exposure that then all kids have to each other. And what you're doing in the flag football, where it's just totally an inclusive environment. Oftentimes kids, since they're just playing with girls or just playing with boys or never playing with kids with disabilities, they don't have any experience with that. And then they get out in the world and they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's just becomes the norm.
Absolutely. So what does mixed gender sport mean to each of you, Carl and Coed, and what are the social implications that you see?
I mean, I think like we were talking about the future, like the future for those kids is like what Kate said is you get a job and you're working 9 to 5 and you're in an adult social sports league and you're playing alongside men and women and you're working alongside men and women, and it's like that's how life plays itself out down the road. And so even if understanding that maybe the travel leagues are going to be the last to adopt this, or certain people won't adopt this, but the earlier kind of experiences with this and with mixed environments, it just seems like it's preparing them for the actual future.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% echo that from my own experiences and from what I've been around long enough in scores to sort of see where kids are landing as young adults. And, honestly, the access to sport and the ability to have the exposure to what it means to participate on a team, what it means to be responsible, what it means to be committed, are the life skills that, you need entirely moving forward, and you're going to be doing it in spaces where you're working with those that are different from you, regardless, if it's disabilities, if it's gender, if it's interest. And so, this is the first foray into that world for youth, and the more opportunity that you can kind of bring it down to a kid level and create these positive experiences, the easier they're just going to flow. And that's what we want, right? We want, to be providing kids with skills that they can use to the future, that they can confidently, pull back on those experiences to support their forward growth. So
amazing. So we're going to go to Slido in just a minute. You can go to as.pn/pp Summit Slido. And actually, my colleague tells me we have some good questions already waiting there. So we're going to start right now. Marty.
Question from Andrew. When my daughters play co-ed sports, the complaint is the boys never pass to the girls. How do you make sure everyone has a positive experience?
Oh, everybody's looking at me. That's just because pass was used in there. Well, we were just talking about this backstage. There are definitely going to be challenges. It's in a team environment. And when I've been thinking about it in my particular space on the soccer side, outside of scores, there are ways in which we can create a better opportunity for that to happen. So yes, I have seen co-ed soccer in my league working exactly like that. The boys are just overrunning, and by co-ed it usually means they put one girl out there. But in this new 4v4 format for 8s and unders, you could literally put 2 boys and 2 girls on the field and create an environment that, there's no way to hide that at this point. So again, there's some intentionality. It isn't just, okay, we're moving to this mixed gender and everybody's good, because you've got to set some parameters. So I think that's where it starts, is a little bit of intention to create, you're gonna have to kind of create some rules around this to get it going in the beginning, especially when you're pushing back on a sport that isn't typically looked at in that way.
Great. Do we have time for just?
I think it depends on what you reward too. So what gets rewarded in sport? If it's going to be winning, then that's what's going to happen. If it's going to be effort and experience and the joy of trying a new skill and succeeding, then I think that can help that problem. But as long as we stay really outcome oriented.
Yeah. Great. Let's take one final question from Slido.
In the future, do you believe that leagues will merge and eradicate the notion of a purely female or male sport? Some sports, such as polo, are completely mixed gender.
I think it depends on the sport. That for a long time, I don't think we'll probably see American football become completely mixed gender for quite a while, if ever. But there are some sports, I think, that will find their survival in mixed gender. that really to maintain, to build what they, a sport that they're gonna, that's how they're going to survive. A good example would be wrestling. I think that where the growth is in wrestling now is in girls. And so, and we have to, obviously there's a lot of education that goes on about, and we still haven't get back past some cultural barriers about whether or not boys can wrestle with girls and what that looks like. But wow, what a sport where, they have the same, they're going by weight, right? So they can figure that out, and particularly up through puberty and even beyond. There are many young women who have successfully wrestled at the high school level and even into college. So I think it is going to be somewhat sport dependent.
Great. Well, that's time, and really a great place to wrap, thinking about the future and what's possible. I want to thank our panelists, Kate, Carl, and Marge, for joining me for this conversation. All of you for being here with us. We hope you'll listen to the podcast. I think we all really appreciated the sentiments of world-class athletes, talking about not just what it means for them as world-class athletes to be participating in mixed gender sport, but also what it could mean for all kids.